A young writer who went from without rags to riches. Also star of Star and Garter, our own Gypsy Rose Lee.
I was born in Seattle as Rose Louise Hovick and had my first brush with fame at age 1, winning a healthy baby contest. As Gypsy Rose Lee, I became famous in burlesque by creating a unique striptease act that was both funny and classy. My mother, Rose Thompson Hovick, was a teenage bride straight out of a convent school when she married Jack Olaf Hovick. At 19, she gave birth to me, Rose Louise, weighing 12 pounds, on January 8, 1911, at 43 and 14 Frontenac Street in West Seattle. She often said the birth was horrific, and I was washed outside in the snow. A second child, my sister June, was born in Vancouver, BC, 2 years later. By this time, my parents' marriage was in trouble, but they stayed together a little longer. My grandfather hadn't allowed my mother, Rose, to go on the stage, so she wanted a career for us instead. My father, Jack Hovick, said we couldn't afford expensive dance lessons. Later, my mother told us that her own mother had warned her against marrying a Norwegian, saying his wife would always come second to the animals in the barn. When my mother, Rose, accused my father of being a tight-fisted Norwegian farmer, he reminded her that he was actually a newspaperman. In my memoir, I mentioned that my father was a reporter for the Seattle Times. However, on my 1911 birth certificate, he is recorded as an ad salesman. After the breakup, my mother Rose and us girls moved back in with her parents in West Seattle. My grandfather, Charlie Thompson, worked for the Great Northern Railway in the baggage room at King Street Station. My grandmother, Anna, was an excellent seamstress and milliner who made extravagant hats and exotic lingerie. She spent months traveling to mining towns and lumber camps from Nevada to the Yukon, selling the flashy clothing to prostitutes. My mother, Rose, set to work to make a performer out of me, but I had no talent at all. I couldn't sing or dance. My little sister June, however, could dance on point at age 2. My grandfather arranged for a debut concert at his lodge hall, and soon baby June was appearing regularly around Seattle. Once she even performed as part of the bill on Anna Pavlova's farewell tour, inspiring my mother to change her billing to Baby June, the pocket-sized Pavlova. Eventually, my sister Baby June got an audition with Alexander Pantages, who had come to Seattle in 1902 and built theaters up and down the West Coast. Soon, she was launched in vaudeville and even appeared in Hollywood movies. June couldn't speak until she was 3, but the films were silent, and she could cry for the cameras when our mother told her that her dog had died. Meanwhile, they gave me a nickname. They called me Plugs. I was a chubby, awkward child with dark hair and a shiny Dutch bob. I stayed in Seattle with my father or grandparents and went to kindergarten, occasionally visiting my mother and sister in Hollywood. When I was 7, I moved to Hollywood to join them permanently. After that, neither my sister nor I went to school anymore. June was now the star of our vaudeville act. The Newsboy Songsters were a rotating group of male street urchins whose parents were glad to have someone feed them. They got pocket money and the promise of theatrical training. I was one of the Newsboy Songsters, and even off stage, I was sometimes dressed as a boy in a knickerbocker suit, cloth cap, and belted leather coat to avoid overshadowing June. People stared at us when we walked down the street, and Dainty June was a powerhouse with top billing who often stopped the show. Madame Rose taught us to lie about our ages to truant officers and train conductors, steal blankets and sheets from hotels, and sneak out without paying. We became practiced shoplifters. Madame Rose wasn't above sabotaging rival acts and was masterful at conning well-wishers out of money with her brave but helpless single mother act. June later said that after the age of 5, she never believed anything our mother said. Despite being a tiny, delicate-looking woman, Rose once managed to push a hotel manager out of a window. Despite Rose's constant pushing, I showed no interest in show business. For years, I had one song in the act, a tough novelty number called Hard-Boiled Rose. Rose later threatened that if I didn't work harder, she would give me away to be legally adopted by my Aunt Helma, my father's sister, and her husband Fred, the managing editor of the Seattle Times. They lived in a big white house on Queen Anne Hill in Seattle. By the late 1920s, vaudeville was dying, and my sister June was getting too old for a kid act. We never knew our real ages until we were grown. June thought she was 13 when she eloped with Bobby Reed, one of the newsboy songsters, but she was probably 3 years older. Rose was furious. She jammed a gun into Bobby's chest and pulled the trigger. Luckily, the safety catch was on. Later on, she pulled a gun on my first husband, but it wasn't loaded. With Dainty June's departure, our act was over. My mother, Rose, and I went back to Seattle to regroup. With backing from my grandfather, we recruited a half-dozen unremarkable adolescent girls who wanted a career in show business. I made costumes for them, and we hit the road as Madame Rose's dancing daughters, with a pig named Porky and an act where we held dolls. The act wasn't a success. I suggested bleaching all their hair platinum blonde and getting them out of the pinafores and ankle socks and into high heels. The act was renamed Rose Louise and Her Hollywood Blondes, with me standing out as the only brunette. Vaudeville was dying. Meanwhile, June and Bobby Reed tried to get an act going, but eventually had to settle for the grueling marathon dance circuit. My mother and I, along with the Hollywood Blondes, were now living in a tent to save money on hotels. My sister, Dainty June, now billed as June Havoc. She played in Shakespeare and Sheridan, and in musicals such as Sweeney Todd and Annie. She now lives on a farm in Connecticut. Madame Rose died in 1954. Her last words were a threat, promising to drag me into death with her. I continued my strip act until the 1950s, with my 12-year-old son Eric as my assistant on the road. After the success of my book and the musical, I moved from New York to a house in Beverly Hills. I passed away in 1970. Click here to learn about Hollywood's wildest hot girl, Tallulah Bankhead.